What kind of war kills you after it ends? What kind of army gives an order to charge when the enemy has already surrendered? What kind of commander lets a man die at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the guns are supposed to fall silent? You've heard of ceasefires. You've heard of victory. But what happened on November 11th, 1918, wasn't peace. It was betrayal in uniform. On that morning, the First World War had officially ended. The armistice was signed at 5:10 a.m. A specific time was chosen. All hostilities would stop at exactly 11 a.m., but instead of standing down, hundreds of generals ordered a final assault. They knew the deadline. They knew the killing would be meaningless. And they did it anyway. They told men to keep advancing across rivers, through forests, into machine guns, not because it would change the war, but because they wanted to end with a bang. Some even hoped their division would score the last kill of the war, as if that was an honor. But what they did was worse than war. It was spectacle. By the end of the day, 2,738 men were dead, shot, blown apart, drowned, gassed. In the final hours of a war that had already ended, some German units tried waving white flags. Allied soldiers kept coming. Others shouted across the trenches, "The war is over," but the officers screamed louder, "Advance!" That wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard that hadn't happened yet, and no one stopped it. One American soldier, Henry Gunther, was shot dead 1 minute before the clock hit 11 o'clock. The Germans didn't want to kill him. They tried to wave him off, but he kept charging, bayonet out, because his commanding officer told him to. Henry collapsed in the mud, chest torn open, and the machine guns went quiet 60 seconds later. That was the cost of someone's pride, of someone's obsession with control. These men didn't die for their countries. They died for someone's timeline, for a schedule, for a closing act in a war that should have ended with silence. And we don't talk about it, because it doesn't fit the story, because it doesn't sound noble, because no one wants to admit that in the final chapter of World War I, the chapter we mark with parades, poems, and poppies, the war machine kept killing long after the gears were supposed to stop. That's not history, that's horror. They signed the end of the war in a train car buried in the French woods, not a palace, not a hall, a cold steel railway carriage in the middle of the Compiègne forest, as if even the men who ended the war couldn't stand to do it in daylight. The time was 5:10 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. 6 men sat around a narrow table, representatives of the Allied forces and the broken German command. The Germans looked like corpses, thin, sleepless, wearing civilian coats over military uniforms they no longer deserved to wear. The French general Ferdinand Foch, sharp-eyed and stiff, barely acknowledged them. He gave them 1 hour to sign. No negotiation, no changes, no mercy. The war was over, and the victors wanted the losers to feel it. They handed them the terms. Germany would evacuate occupied territories, surrender military equipment, release prisoners of war, and accept blame. The Germans hesitated, humiliated, but what choice did they have? Their people were starving, their armies were fractured, their empire was gone. They signed. But there was one line in that document that no one in the room would be brave enough to question. All hostilities shall cease at 11 a.m. Paris time. Not immediately, not upon signing, not even within the hour. 6 more hours of war were authorized. On paper, it sounded practical. Armies needed time to get the message, field telegraphs, couriers, distant battalions. But in reality, every general across the Western Front knew before dawn the war would end at 11. They had time to stop it. They had hours to hold fire, to hold position, to keep men alive for their families. But many didn't. Some used that window like a final chapter. one last chance to prove themselves, one final burst of control, one more ribbon for the uniform. They issued fresh orders, new offensives, final charges, and soldiers who had just brewed coffee in their helmets were suddenly handed instructions to advance on German trenches, knowing full well that those same trenches would be abandoned by lunchtime. What do you call a battle fought after the surrender has been signed? Not war, not duty, execution, because the only thing that mattered in those final hours was who was willing to kill before the deadline. And many were. They didn't whisper the orders. They didn't issue them in secret. They wrote them down, stamped them, signed their names. Final offensives were launched that morning not because of miscommunication, but because some commanders refused to let the war end without a final show of force. They had 6 hours, and they planned to use every minute of it. At 5:30 a.m., just 20 minutes after the armistice was signed, American General Charles P. Summerall issued orders to cross the Meuse River. It was suicide. The riverbanks were steep. The bridges were destroyed. German machine guns were dug into the hills on the far side, waiting. And the war, the actual war, was already over. His staff tried to reason with him. Some asked if he wanted to hold the line until 11. He refused. He wanted to keep pressure on the enemy. He wanted momentum. He wanted legacy. And so, thousands of U.S. soldiers, mostly in their teens and early 20s, were told to wade into a freezing river while under enemy fire. Some never made it off the banks. Others drowned in the current, their bodies swept downstream, while the generals sat dry in command posts. One survivor said it felt like they were charging into the ghost of a war that wouldn't admit it was dead. In the official records, Summerall later wrote that the operation was successful in securing territory before the cessation of hostilities. But what he didn't mention were the 1,100 casualties, men torn apart in a battle that had no reason to exist. And he wasn't the only one. Across the front, in villages with names like Chaumont, Ormont, and Saint-Hilaire, commanders issued orders that turned into executions. General William M. Wright pushed his men to take the French town of Stenay, not because it held tactical value, not because it was part of the armistice conditions, but because it had hot water. His soldiers had been living in filth and mud for months, and the village had public bathhouses. Wright wanted to give his men a final comfort, not by waiting, but by capturing the town before 11. He sent them street by street, house by house, against retreating German troops who didn't even want to fight anymore. The result, over 300 men dead for the right to bathe. That's how the war ended for them, not in honor, but in steam. Further north, British units near Mons were told to advance through minefields and broken trenches. Their commanders wanted the symbolic victory of taking back the town where the British Expeditionary Force had first clashed with the Germans in 1914. A full circle moment, a war-ending statement, but the town would be handed over peacefully hours later. Still, they went. One officer reportedly said, "We started here. We'll finish here," as if war were a theater performance, as if blood were just another curtain call. There were also smaller, quieter deaths, the kind that don't make maps or memoirs. Platoons sent to patrol empty forests, sniper teams ordered to move through open fields for one last recon, messenger boys riding between units and getting blown apart by artillery shells launched before either side knew what they were still aiming at. Some commanders, paranoid that the armistice was a trap, doubled down on their orders, telling their men to keep killing until the last second, just in case the Germans changed their minds. It wasn't fear, it was pride dressed as fear, because they knew the Germans had agreed. They had read the terms, they had seen the surrender, but they couldn't let it end in stillness. They needed noise. They needed an ending that sounded like victory. Meanwhile, German commanders had mostly issued stand-down orders by dawn. Many of them, exhausted and starved, told their men to hold positions but not to fire unless provoked. Some even started withdrawing from frontline trenches in anticipation of the ceasefire. But what were they supposed to do when Allied troops kept advancing? Raise their hands? Wave handkerchiefs? In some cases, they did, and were shot anyway, not out of cruelty, but confusion. The Allied soldiers weren't told what was happening. Many of them believed they were still fighting for real ground. In truth, they were pawns in a final performance, dying to give shape to someone else's story. At 7:15 a.m. in the forest near Verdun, American troops were told to clear out a German machine gun nest that had been identified weeks earlier. The intelligence was outdated, the position had been abandoned, but the order stood. They approached the hill under fire. 3 men were killed before they realized the bunker was empty. Inside, they found nothing but rotting food, an old helmet, and a field manual left behind. One soldier collapsed on the ground and laughed. Another threw up. A third pulled a photo of his wife from his pocket and stared at it, saying nothing. They had followed an order straight into a tomb, and no one would be held responsible. By 8:30 a.m., the Western Front was still echoing with shell fire. Entire towns still shook. Civilians in villages caught between the lines were hiding in cellars, unsure whether to celebrate or dig graves. Some families had heard rumors of peace and came outside, only to be killed by artillery fired in the final hours. In one documented case, a family of 5 in northern France was killed when a shell landed in their garden at 9:12 a.m. The war ended before they could be buried. By the time the final hour began, that last stretch between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., everyone knew. Not just the generals, but the officers, the platoon leaders, the runners and medics. Even the men at the front had heard. Ceasefire at 11, they said. It's really over. Some smiled, some wept, others just stared blankly. No cheers, no songs, just disbelief, the kind that builds when you've survived the impossible and then get told, just one more hour. And then somehow the worst part began, because the orders didn't stop. They got louder, fewer questions, fewer hesitations, more commands, more charges. In that final hour, when peace was not just on paper, but ticking visibly toward them like a promise in the sky, thousands of soldiers were ordered to move. American, French, Canadian, British, told to advance, told to fire, told to take one last position before the clock ran out. What were they taking it for? Nothing. Every trench, hill, village, and foot of land captured in that last hour would be returned or abandoned within days. The war had already ended, but no one was willing to stop dying just because the clock said so. At 10:15 a.m., near the French village of Ville-devant-Chaumont, an American company was told to sweep a German bunker network. The Germans had already begun pulling back. They had been ordered not to fire unless provoked. But when the Americans charged, bayonets fixed, boots crashing through frost, the German machine gunners opened fire. They had no choice. They watched the men come, waving rifles, and did what they were trained to do. 7 Americans died in the first 30 seconds. One was a 19-year-old from Iowa. His brother survived the charge and later said in a letter home, he was smiling when he fell. I think he thought it was over. It was. Just not for him. 10 minutes later, a French platoon crossed a barbed wire field near the village of Flabas. They had been told to test German defenses one final time. No backup, no clear reason, just a command. As they moved forward, they stepped into a trap. Mines buried months earlier. 2 were blown in half instantly. Their bodies were never recovered in full. A third soldier, crawling away with one leg, screamed for the others to leave him. They didn't. They tried to carry him and were cut down by a German sniper who had stayed behind. unwilling to be shot retreating. By the time it was over, 6 men were dead, 4 were wounded, and the field they crossed had no value at all. It wasn't even mentioned in the war logs. At 10:45 a.m. near Ors, the British poet Wilfred Owen, already celebrated for his haunting verses about gas attacks and trench death, was shot through the head while leading an assault on a canal. His mother received the telegram announcing his death exactly 1 week later on Armistice Day, while church bells rang in celebration. He had written just days before, "I came out in order to help these boys directly." By leading them as well as an officer can, he led them to their end. The canal was irrelevant, his death was treated as tragic, but the real tragedy was that it didn't have to happen. And then came the most symbolic killing of them all, Private Henry Gunther, Baltimore native, German-American, former supply sergeant. He had been demoted earlier that year for writing a letter home urging friends not to enlist. His words were read by censors, and he was accused of hurting morale. He had spent months trying to redeem himself. His commanding officer thought he lacked courage. On the morning of November 11th, Gunther's unit was advancing through the Meuse-Argonne. They encountered a German machine gun position. The Germans were waving them off, shouting, "The war is over." But Gunther didn't stop. He sprinted ahead of his unit, rifle raised, bayonet fixed, charging the German post alone. The Germans didn't want to fire. One of them later said they hesitated, but when Gunther got within yards, they shot. A single burst. He dropped instantly. Time of death, 10:59 a.m. The final American soldier to die in World War I was killed exactly 1 minute before peace took effect. He was posthumously awarded his rank back. They called it bravery, but the Germans who killed him called it madness. They buried him with full respect. A war had just ended, and they had no joy left in them. At 11 a.m., the clocks struck. Bugles were blown. Some sectors went dead silent. Others still echoed with trailing gunfire and delayed orders. And for the men who survived that last hour, peace didn't feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. They were surrounded by blood that hadn't dried, boots still twitching, friends dying as the bells rang. It didn't feel like something had ended. It felt like the lie had finally stopped pretending. At exactly 11 a.m., time didn't explode. It stopped. No final roar, no national anthem, just silence. Thick, unnatural, and disorienting. It fell like fog across the front, swallowing sound faster than soldiers could process what it meant. The guns, which had thundered without pause for years, cut off in mid-sentence. Artillery crews left shells half-loaded. Machine gunners lifted their hands from hot barrels. Snipers stared through scopes, but did not fire. It was as if the world had been screaming for 4 years and suddenly forgot how. But silence isn't always peace. For the men on the ground, soldiers covered in blood that wasn't theirs, standing knee-deep in churned earth, surrounded by the dead and the twitching. That silence was not a release. It was a trapdoor. It made everything louder. The moans of the wounded, the whimper of a horse with its legs blown off, the soft pop of boots shifting in mud. Some soldiers stood up slowly, expecting another shot. Others ducked out of habit. A few kept firing, not realizing the moment had arrived. Others simply couldn't stop. Their hands kept moving, reloading, cocking, breathing through a rhythm the war had etched into their muscles. One man reportedly shouted, "Is it really over?" and got no answer, just a nod from a dazed officer who looked like he'd aged a decade in an hour. In a shattered farmhouse in northern France, a unit of American infantry stood in a circle around a boy, no older than 18, who had been hit by shrapnel just 5 minutes before the ceasefire. His lungs were filling with blood. He stared at the sky. He said nothing. The men around him said nothing either. They watched him die in perfect silence. There was no last word, just his chest rising slower, then stopping. That was their peace. In another sector, a German unit raised a white flag and climbed out of the trench. No one shot at them. They didn't cheer. They didn't smile. One soldier reportedly dropped to his knees, not to pray, just because he had nothing left to stand for. A British soldier climbed out to meet him. They didn't shake hands. They just looked at each other like ghosts who had haunted the same graveyard too long. Across Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and Germany, men lit cigarettes with trembling fingers. Some passed around letters they had never gotten the chance to send. Others just stood in mud, staring at the watch on their wrist as if expecting it to start ticking backward and undo the morning. No one really knew what to do with the stillness. It felt wrong, like a trick, like a trap. They had spent years reacting to every sound, ducking, dodging, firing back, and now the absence of sound was more terrifying than the shells. A few soldiers began whispering. Some laughed hysterically. A few wept, not from joy, but from guilt, because the man next to them had died 10 minutes too early. Because the orders had come too late, because now that it was over, they could finally ask themselves, why him and not me? And there were no answers. In some sectors, men were ordered to line up for photographs, smiling, holding up signs that said 11 a.m. Some of those photos still exist, black and white, blurry images of men pretending they were relieved, pretending they were whole. But behind them, just out of frame, are the stretchers, the piled helmets, the bodies no one had moved yet because they didn't know if they should. The war was over, but the dying wasn't done. Some of the wounded wouldn't live to see the sun go down. Some had no hands left to sign their own discharge papers. In a field near Sedan, a French medic dropped to his knees, covered in blood and dirt, and began laughing so hard he vomited. His comrades didn't stop him. They didn't speak. They were too tired, too angry, because minutes earlier they had watched 3 boys, all from the same village, take a direct hit from a mortar that was fired at 10:58. 2 of the boys were obliterated. The third lived just long enough to ask, "Did we win?" No one answered. The silence did. While soldiers were still bleeding in the mud, the men who never touched the front lines were already raising their glasses. At 11:01 a.m., in cities untouched by war's teeth, the news swept through streets like wildfire. It's over. Church bells rang. Whistles blew. Champagne was uncorked in boardrooms and newspaper offices. Politicians hugged each other with wide grins and tearful pride. Crowds danced in boulevards, throwing hats in the air, shaking hands with strangers, kissing faces they didn't know. But they didn't see the last body fall. They didn't hear the gurgled last breath of a boy who bled out 2 minutes before the ceasefire. They didn't feel the weight of commanding a man into death when peace was already written. In Washington, D.C., bells tolled and traffic stopped. The president's office was flooded with handshakes and patriotic noise. In London, Big Ben roared across the Thames, drowning out the sounds of a nation trying to forget the price. But none of those bells rang loud enough to cover what had happened just an hour before. In Paris, the Prime Minister gave a speech calling it the final sacrifice for peace. But those who died that morning weren't sacrifices. They were collateral, not of war, but of vanity, of politics, of men who wanted closure with a headline, not with decency. In the days that followed, newspapers would print the word victory in massive fonts, photos of smiling troops, marching bands, poems about heroes and liberty. But the names of the 2,738 men who died on November 11th, scattered, forgotten, buried beneath euphemisms like final offensives and last-minute resistance. Their deaths were branded as unavoidable or honorable. But the documents, the real ones, the field orders, the typed commands with timestamps, tell another story. They show us generals who knew the armistice was signed and still pushed their men forward. They show us war rooms where ceasefire clocks were ticking down, and still New missions were drawn. Some historians later tried to justify it. They said communication was slow, confusion was natural, orders had to be followed. But that's a lie told in comfort. Telegraph lines worked, couriers ran fast, officers had radios, and many who gave the orders weren't confused. They were calculated. They saw the armistice not as an end, but a deadline, a final window, a last chance to prove something. Take ground, take glory, take revenge. One French general was asked years later why he ordered an attack at 10:30 a.m., knowing full well the war would end in 30 minutes. His answer: "I didn't want the Germans to think we were weak, and so men died. To protect the ego of a man in a polished coat." They were never told that's why they were charging. They thought they were finishing the war, but the war had finished them. And as celebrations erupted across the world, from cafes in Canada to pubs in Manchester, from New York sidewalks to Berlin living rooms, something darker began to take shape. Erasure. The truth about the last day was too shameful, too inconvenient, too human. It didn't fit the story of triumph. It didn't sound like victory, so the narrative was quickly rewritten. The war ended at 11 a.m., full stop. No footnotes, no ghosts, no mention of the men who died while politicians were adjusting their ties, and the war machine, which had just ground to a halt, shifted into its next role, memory maker. It began crafting statues, naming squares, publishing memoirs that ended with hugs and handshakes, never with blood-soaked boots on riverbanks. But some survivors remembered. They wrote letters, kept journals, told their children quietly, not in bitterness, but in clarity. They remembered the screams at 10:58, the bullet wounds that didn't know the clock, the final breath of the last man shot, falling into a silence he didn't live to hear. They knew that peace didn't arrive clean. It came wearing someone else's uniform, standing on someone else's grave. Peace came with paperwork, not healing. Soldiers who survived the final morning didn't walk away cheering. They didn't hug and cry and march home to parades. They stood still. They looked around at the bodies that fell minutes before the bell, and they couldn't move. They weren't shell-shocked in the way textbooks describe. They were suspended, stunned into a quiet that went deeper than silence. It was the silence of meaning unraveling, the silence of realizing they weren't the lucky ones. They were just the ones left. Some refused to speak of the war ever again. Others went home and lived quietly, never telling their families what they saw at 10:59 a.m. Because how do you explain to your child that your best friend died after the war ended? That you had to write a letter to his mother while knowing her son's death was timed, not fated? That you carried the weight of orders that no man should have received in the name of honor? They came home with broken bodies and heavier souls. Some were awarded medals for their bravery during those last-minute offensives. They didn't want them. A few refused to attend the ceremonies. One soldier told his officer, "If I take that ribbon, I'll hang myself with it." His brother had died on the banks of the Meuse. Ordered to cross a river they knew they'd surrender the next day. He wasn't angry at the Germans. He was angry at the watch that said 10:50. Others came back to silence. No parades, no questions, just jobs to return to, suits to wear, families who couldn't understand the war behind their eyes. And what they remembered most wasn't the battles, the noise, the chaos. It was those last 6 hours, that window of deliberate death, the way the world pretended it was over, while it kept chewing. Some wrote books, but they rarely told the full story. Publishers wanted heroism. They wanted drama. They wanted redemption arcs. They didn't want the story of a 19-year-old who drowned crossing a river after the peace was signed. They didn't want to hear about men bayoneting retreating enemies who had already packed up their gear. They didn't want the line, "My friend died 5 minutes before the end." It didn't sell. It didn't feel right. It didn't match the music being played in town squares across the globe. So the truth stayed where it always does, in diaries, in nightmares, in the breath caught at the back of a throat when someone asks, "What was the war like?" And many veterans would answer with a version of the same thing: "It ended too late." And that delay, that exact delay, haunted them, not because of the blood, not even because of the betrayal, but because it proved that peace is not the opposite of war. Sometimes peace is the stage war steps onto to give itself a standing ovation, and the men who survived knew they were props in that performance. They were the ones told to charge, not for country, not for justice, but for one final headline. The Allies advanced until the very end. That's what the papers said. But the truth? The Allies killed until the clock ran out. So did the Germans. And history politely clapped and then moved on. Governments don't mourn, they revise. And within months of the armistice, that's exactly what happened. The final morning of World War I, the one that cost 2,738 lives after peace had been signed, was not broadcast, memorialized, or taught. It was brushed out. The official narrative became clean, linear, cinematic. The war ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A sentence polished for classrooms and monuments. Simple, poetic, Lieutenant. Because in truth, the war didn't end at 11 a.m. It collapsed at 11 a.m. after a final stretch of state-sanctioned murder was allowed to play out in the shadow of paperwork. But that version was too uncomfortable to teach, too damning, too recent, so the textbooks skipped it. They taught trench warfare, gas masks, Versailles. They showed photographs of troops waving flags, smiling, hugging French civilians, the kind of images that make children believe in peace. But they didn't show the bodies that fell in the hour after peace was signed. They didn't print the orders that sent men into combat at 10:58. They didn't explain that entire hills were captured that morning just so a commander could write his name beside a victory and then give it up the next day without a second thought. And so a generation was raised believing that the war ended the way movies show it, with trumpets and flags and men throwing helmets in the air. But if you stood on the banks of the Meuse that day, you'd see something else entirely. You'd see men crouching in frozen mud, eyes wide, chests rising too fast, whispering the time. You'd hear final screams. You'd smell burning wool. You'd feel the vibration of artillery that didn't know it was supposed to be quiet. And you'd know instantly that no one told the truth. Because truth doesn't win elections. It doesn't fund parades. It doesn't comfort mothers who ask why their sons were buried with bullets in their backs after the ink dried on the ceasefire. Over the years, even historians softened the edge. They spoke of communications delays, of lack of confirmation, of chaotic conditions, all of which might have been believable, if not for the precise timestamps on the orders, if not for the testimonies of generals who admitted they knew, if not for the survivors who remembered watching their commanding officers weep in private after realizing what they'd done. But the truth was difficult to hold. It burned the hands, so it was shelved. The real story of November 11th, 1918 became an underground history, told only in certain books, whispered at veteran reunions, or passed through letters no one wanted to read twice. And the worst part, most of the men who gave the final orders were never held accountable. Some were promoted, decorated, given medals and pensions. Others went on to write memoirs where the final day was sanitized or omitted entirely. Not because they forgot, but because history gave them permission to. After all, Who would want to believe that a nation's final act in the war to end all wars was to knowingly keep it going for one more morning? There was a man who didn't make it, not because of fear, not because of injury, but because of a number on a page. His name was Private Henry Nicholas Gunther, and to this day, he holds the grim distinction of being the last known combat death of World War I, a fact no statue mentions, no anthem sings, because what happened to him doesn't feel like history. It feels like a mistake printed in blood. Henry was 23rd German American. He had been demoted from sergeant after writing a letter home, urging a friend not to enlist. Military censors flagged it, said it weakened morale, said it was unpatriotic, said the war was bigger than one man's fear. So they punished him, stripped his rank, labeled him insubordinate, and Henry, carrying that shame like lead in his boots, tried for months to prove his loyalty. His unit was stationed near Chaumont-devant-Damvillers on the morning of November 11th, 1918. The ceasefire had been signed. Everyone knew. The message had reached both sides. The war would end at 11 a.m. It was 10:59. Henry Gunther fixed his bayonet and ran, alone, toward a German machine gun nest. His fellow soldiers yelled at him to stop. The Germans waved him off, literally waved, shouting at him to go back. They didn't want to shoot. They knew the war was over in 60 seconds. But Henry kept running, charging, rifle raised, not for victory, not for strategy, but maybe, just maybe, for redemption, for a rank he'd lost, for guilt, for silence, for something deeper than orders, more haunting than honor. And with seconds left on the clock, the German gunners fired once. A single burst. Henry was hit in the chest. He dropped instantly, dead before he hit the mud. The official time of death, 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before peace, 1 minute after war should have been over, at least for him. Witnesses said the Germans who shot him were devastated. They didn't celebrate. They didn't scavenge the body. One came forward years later and said, "He forced us. We begged him to stop." But history doesn't measure intentions, only impact. And so Henry's name was written into the record books not as a cautionary tale, but as a technicality. Final U.S. soldier killed in the war. That's all. One line, a number, a symbol, but not a person. His family received the news, a folded flag, a citation, a mention that he had died bravely in service. But nowhere did it say he died after everyone already knew it was over. Nowhere did it mention the look on the German soldiers' faces. Nowhere did it explain that Henry Gunther might have been trying to kill the shame in his chest more than the enemy in front of him. And even after that, even after he fell, the quiet wasn't immediate. In other sectors, gunfire echoed for minutes, delayed reactions, final bursts, miscommunication, or maybe men who didn't know how to stop. Because war doesn't end when the clock says it should. It ends when the soul releases it. And some souls, like Henry's, never got that chance. Why do wars end like this? Why does the final page of every bloody chapter seem to blur with contradiction, cruelty, and paperwork soaked in irony? It should have been so simple. The war ends when the leaders say it ends. When the ink is dry, the guns fall silent. But history doesn't follow signatures. It follows power. And power doesn't like to leave quietly. It wants applause. It wants a closing act. It wants to write the final sentence with a flourish, even if it means dragging thousands of men through the dirt to underline it. And in the case of World War I, that flourish cost nearly 3,000 lives, not in the fog of confusion, not in the chaos of a final siege, but in the cold, calculated space between peace and pride. This is the part of war history doesn't show, because it's not dramatic. It's tragic, not noble, just cruel. It's the part where generals, knowing the war was over, still issued commands. the part where soldiers advanced into machine gun fire not because the enemy was advancing, but because orders don't carry timestamps of conscience. They carry rank, and rank in the final hour of the Great War mattered more than the men wearing it. We don't like to admit that, because it undoes the myth we build around conflict. We teach that wars are hellish but purposeful, that they begin with chaos but end with clarity, that men die for ideals, for borders, for peace. But no one dies for peace. Peace, if it comes, is just the door that opens after too many have been thrown into the fire. And those who die last, they die in silence, in confusion, in the fine print. That's where history hides its most shameful truth. The war didn't refuse to end. The leaders did. They had the power to stop it, and they didn't. Why? Because to many of them, those final hours were more than delay. They were opportunity to reclaim honor, to be the last one who took a hill, to win a final skirmish that would look good on a resume, and for some, simply because they couldn't imagine not giving an order, because silence felt like defeat. There's something sick in the rhythm of how wars end, not just in 1918. Over and over, across centuries, we see the same pattern. The agreement is signed, the diplomats shake hands, and yet, somewhere in a trench, in a village, in a jungle, men keep dying. Why? Because messages travel slower than ambition, because pride outruns reason, because some commanders see the armistice not as salvation, but as a countdown, a final opportunity to shape the story. And once you understand that, you start to realize how easily history becomes myth, the kind of myth that smooths over 2,738 deaths with the phrase, the 11th hour. The kind of myth that teaches students peace came like a sunrise, instead of what it really was, a siren no one believed until the bleeding stopped. And yet, when you bring this up, when you ask why so many died after peace was signed, the answers are always the same. Communication was poor. The terrain was hard. The enemy didn't respond. But those aren't reasons. Those are excuses disguised as logistics, and they don't explain the cold fact that generals knew. The telegrams were delivered, the ceasefire was confirmed, and still some ordered attacks, ordered crossings, ordered charges. Men were told to leave trenches and storm hills that no longer mattered, against enemies who no longer wanted to fight, because someone, somewhere, needed a final statistic, not of survival, but of success. Henry Gunther wasn't the only one. He was just the last. There were thousands like him, men who carried out final orders in the minutes before 11 a.m., soldiers who had watched their comrades fall only to be told to advance one more time. And why? Not to secure ground, not to prevent surprise, but because a commanding officer didn't want to appear weak, because a battalion hadn't proven itself yet, because someone feared that ending the war without one last show of force would be seen as surrender. So they sacrificed men for optics, for ego, for nothing. That's the cruelty of the final hours, not the death, but the meaninglessness of it, the randomness. The paperwork said over, but the ground still demanded blood, and that's what no monument explains. That's why so many veterans went home and never spoke of that morning, because they didn't know how to make sense of it. How do you explain watching a man die after the fighting was declared finished? How do you justify pulling a trigger when the clock says peace has already begun? You don't. You carry it, quietly, sometimes forever. And maybe that's why so many of them never told the real story. Because it wasn't a story, it was a scar. A ripple in time where logic collapsed and orders outweighed mercy. They remembered it not as a moment of closure, but as a violation. Not because war is supposed to be clean, but because if you survive it, you at least hope the end will make sense. But November 11th, 1918 didn't make sense. It was chaos wearing the mask of coordination. It was celebration hiding behind a wall of screams. It was a scripted ending to an unscripted death spiral. And this is why we tell this story now, because history owes those men a truth it never gave them, a truth not printed in textbooks or carved in granite, but told plainly, painfully, that the last 24 hours of World War I were not noble. They were not brave. They were not the final crescendo of honor. They were a tragedy of choice, a preventable loss, an act of deliberate delay. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how loud the bells ring every November, no matter how many speeches are given about sacrifice and glory, nothing can change the fact that when peace was signed, war still had one more hour to kill. The men who came home from that final morning carried something heavier than injury, heavier than loss. They carried a silence so loud it split their memory into two halves, the part they could live with, and the part they could never speak of. For most of them, the day the world celebrated peace was not a day of relief. It was a day of betrayal. Not because the war ended, but because it ended wrong. You see, war breaks you slowly, over months, over wounds, over hunger and fear and letters that stop arriving. But the last day, that shattered them instantly. There were men who had survived Ypres, survived gas, survived being buried alive in trench cave-ins, who came home from November 11th and never spoke again. Some refused to attend Armistice Day events for the rest of their lives. Others smiled in public and collapsed in private, their minds stuck in that final hour, watching a friend get shot in the back during a ceasefire. Because what do you do with a memory like that? A memory the world refuses to admit even happened? You bury it, or you try. Some wrote it down, in diaries, in letters never sent, in short fragments hidden between Bible pages or inside drawers no one was meant to open, and the words all sounded the same. We knew it was over. They sent us anyway. There were children who grew up wondering why their fathers would go silent at 11 a.m. every November, why their hands would tremble when a bell rang, why they couldn't finish stories about the war without their voices cracking in the last sentence. And they didn't understand, not at first, that their fathers weren't broken by battle. They were broken by timing, by a final betrayal that no metal could mend. And there were wives who watched those men wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering names that no longer had bodies. Some of those wives tried to ask. Most stopped trying, because the answers never came in full. Just fragments, like, it was supposed to be over, or he didn't need to die, or I told them to wait, but they wouldn't listen. And over time, those fragments became more terrifying than the silence itself. And yet the world moved on. It always does. Cities rebuilt, flags were folded, school books were written, and the story of World War I became cleaner with every retelling. The trenches became history, not trauma. The death toll became a number, not a weight. And the final day, November 11th, 1918, became a symbol, not a scar. In Britain, people wore poppies and bowed their heads. In America, Armistice Day became Veterans Day. In France, children learned about the Great Victory. But in all that commemoration, no one asked the most important question: who died last and why? No one taught that on the very morning of peace, officers knowingly sent men to their deaths. That some did it out of ambition, some out of pride, some just because they didn't believe orders were real until a clock struck 11, and the truth faded, just like the veterans did. They died slowly, quietly, one by one, their stories folded into silence. By the 1950s, most of the men who had survived that last day were gone. A few tried to speak before they passed. Some gave interviews, wrote books. One soldier, a Frenchman named Louis, said, "My friend was killed at 10:59. They said it was glorious. "I say it was murder." That quote was removed from the final article. Editors didn't want to dampen the spirit of remembrance. Another veteran American gave a speech at a small town hall in Ohio. He said, "I don't march in parades. I march in nightmares, and the man I see every time was killed by a decision, not a bullet." The microphone cut out halfway through. The audience didn't clap, because no one wants to hear that history, especially patriotic history, ends in shame. That's not how we like our wars. We like beginnings with villains, middles with valor, endings with celebration. We don't want the final chapter to be filled with unnecessary orders and confused deaths and clocks ticking down while men bleed in the dirt. But that's what happened, and the survivors knew it. They lived with that contradiction every day. That while the world toasted victory, they were holding on to the memory of men who screamed as they drowned crossing rivers that were irrelevant by morning. And they weren't just mourning the dead. They were mourning the truth, the one no one wanted. There were monuments built, but not for the last ones. There were books written, but they skipped the final hour. Movies were made, but they ended at 11 a.m. with hugs and horn blasts, not with a boy crumpling in a forest while holding a photo of his fiancée. And so, the survivors understood something long before the rest of us ever would, that wars never end when the clock says they do. They end when the men who gave the last order finally admit they shouldn't have. And that confession never came. Not from the generals, not from the politicians, not from the commanders who looked at the time, saw 10:45 a.m., and said, "Advance." So the men who lived through that hour became custodians of an unwelcome truth, and some of them, a small few, dedicated their final years to telling it. They gave lectures in basements, wrote op-eds that were rarely published, spoke at gatherings where most people just wanted the war stories to be over already, but they kept talking, kept saying it out loud, because they knew that silence was what allowed it to happen in the first place. That if no one said it, it would happen again. And it did. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in every war since, there have been final days where bullets kept flying, even after treaties were signed. Because the machine doesn't stop cleanly. It sputters, it seizes, it claws for one more hour of power, and men die in that hour. Not because they're heroes, but because someone in a room far away is still trying to win the story. Every November 11th, people pause. They stand in silence. They wear poppies. They post tributes. In churches and town squares, at memorials, and under flickering classroom projectors, the same sentence is whispered like gospel. The war ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It's recited with reverence, printed in textbooks, engraved in stone. But beneath the ritual lies a lie, a comforting, clean, digestible lie. Because the war did not end at 11 a.m., it bled out slowly, painfully, and pointlessly until the final second. The last hour of World War I was not a moment of glory. It was a moment of expendability. And yet, instead of facing that, the world built a memory so sanitized that it buried the truth alive. Monuments rose, statues were cast, bells were forged to mark the moment peace returned, but none of them bear the names of the men who died after peace had already been signed. None of them mention Henry Gunther. None of them show what really happened between 5:10 a.m. when the papers were signed and 11 a.m. when the dying was finally allowed to stop. Because if they did, they would have to admit something unbearable, that the final blood of the Great War was spilled for no reason at all. How do you carve that into granite? You don't. You carve something safer. You say sacrifice. You say honor. You say last breath for freedom. And it becomes a ritual, a performance, something to make the living feel noble instead of responsible. But rituals don't heal the dead, and monuments don't correct memory. They only harden it. And over the years, that hardened memory became untouchable. Teachers didn't question it. Journalists didn't probe it. Politicians didn't mention it. because doing so would mean pulling back the curtain and revealing the face of a truth we've avoided for over a century, that wars don't end when we say they do. They end when we stop killing. And for World War I, we didn't stop, not even when the ink dried. Think about what that means. Imagine if, on the day the pandemic officially ended, hospitals had still been told to admit patients for no reason. Or if, after a hostage situation was resolved, the final team was ordered to breach anyway. That's what happened on November 11th, 1918. The danger was over. The peace was signed. But the orders kept coming. And men followed them because disobedience meant court-martial. Because loyalty meant silence. Because in war, the clock on the wall means nothing if the man above you says go. And so we celebrate a moment that never truly existed. A clean ending that only looks clean because we've scrubbed away the blood. And what does that do to a society? What happens when we honor a version of history that erases its darkest hour? We become numb to repetition. We miss the warnings. We allow it to happen again. How many times since have we watched treaties get signed, peace declared, only to hear gunfire in the distance afterward? How many more Henry Gunthers will it take before we accept that the last day of war is often the most dishonest? Not just in World War I, in every war that followed. The end is never the end. It's a negotiated illusion, a paper illusion, while somewhere out of frame, someone is still bleeding for a battle that should have been called off hours earlier. The real tragedy of November 11th isn't just what happened, it's how we've chosen to remember it. We didn't just bury the dead, we buried their context, their circumstances, their right to not die. We turned a mass betrayal into a morning of celebration, and in doing so, we taught generations to look away from the moments when power fails its own people. We taught them to see the finish line, not the bodies just before it. We taught them to trust the clock, not the blood trail. And so the lie became legacy, and the silence became tradition. And what of those who still tried to speak? The veterans, the historians, the descendants of men who died at 1058? Most were ignored. Some were called bitter. Others were told not to tarnish the day. But the truth isn't a tarnish. It's a mirror. And the reason it scares people is because it reflects not just what happened, but who allowed it. The commanders, the generals, the bureaucrats who could have sent one more message, made one more phone call, but didn't. And maybe that's why the world clings to the 11 a.m. myth so tightly, because it allows us to pretend no one had to die that morning, that it was unavoidable, that fate, not failure, was to blame. But that's a lie. It was preventable. It was avoidable. It was a choice. And maybe that's why this truth still matters, not just as a historical footnote, but as a warning, because we are still a species obsessed with endings. We want resolution, closure, celebration, and in that rush we often ignore the cost of getting there. We allow the final scene to overwrite the final scream. But if we want to honor the dead, truly honor them, we must first admit that many of them died not for country, not for strategy, but for ego, for timing, for someone's desire to finish strong. And until we say that out loud, we haven't remembered them. We've erased them. There are stories that comfort us, and stories that convict us. What happened on November 11th, 1918 belongs to the second kind. It is not a celebration. It is not closure. It is not a morning of flowers and doves and generals wiping their eyes on balconies. It is a moment of moral failure, one that spanned 6 hours, 2,738 deaths, and a silence that fell far too late. The war didn't refuse to end. We did. And every time we repeat the myth, every time we say the 11th hour ended the bloodshed, we betray the men who were still bleeding at 1059. We betray Henry Gunther. We betray the unknown soldier who drowned in the Meuse. We betray the French runner shot while delivering a message the enemy had already read. These weren't heroic deaths. They weren't necessary. They were executions carried out in slow motion by a system too proud to stop. and a command too cowardly to take responsibility. And now, 100 years later, we are still trying to decide what to do with that truth. Do we bury it again, wrap it in silence, and seal it beneath the bronze feet of statues? Or do we finally say what should have been said in 1918? We knew, and we let them die anyway, because that is the part history always avoids. Not the brutality of war, but the bureaucracy of its endings. The signatures were dry, the terms agreed, and yet every minute until the clock struck 11 was treated as expendable. Not for strategy, not for security, but for posture. Posture. That toxic, slow-killing poison that sits inside uniforms and whispers, win one more, take one more hill, show them we're stronger. It wasn't war anymore. It was theater. It was a final act written in mud and smoke and silence, where the actors didn't know the play had already closed. And the audience? The world applauded while they died, because they believed what they were told. That the guns fell quiet together, that peace washed over Europe like a wave, that no one died in the minutes before freedom arrived. But the truth? It wasn't a wave. It was a whimper. It was one man falling forward in disbelief while birds circled overhead. It was the last scream from a trench that never made it past the trees. It was a bullet fired not in rage, but in obedience. And now, all these years later, we are left with their ghosts, not the kind that haunt buildings, but the kind that sit inside silence, the kind that stir when bells ring at 11 a.m., the kind that watch the poppies pinned to coats and ask quietly, "Do you remember me?" Or just the version they told you? And for most, the answer is the latter. We remember the myth, we remember the armistice, we remember the headlines, but we forget the minute-by-minute truth, because it doesn't fit into parades, it doesn't belong in anthem lyrics, it doesn't look good in bronze. But if you truly want to understand war, not glorify it, not politicize it, not sanitize it, you must look there. You must look at 10:50 a.m., 10:55, 10:59. You must stare at the second before peace and ask yourself what it cost, because that's the real ending. That's the real memorial. And maybe if we had done that earlier, if we had confronted this story when the last veterans were still alive, we wouldn't be so quick to send men off to die now. Maybe if we understood how many commanders gambled lives to finish their war with one last quote, we wouldn't cheer so easily when history repeats, because it always does. The lie gets reused, the timeline recycled. Just one more day, one more mission, one more push. And somewhere, beneath that command, a man steps forward, believing the peace has already begun, and falls anyway. That's not history. That's policy. And it's been written in too many languages, in too many countries, across too many wars to ignore. And it all began here, on this morning, in this 6-hour window, where the world could have chosen mercy, and instead chose image. So here's how we remember them now. Not with slogans, not with silence, but with truth. With full stops and uncomfortable questions and the audacity to say, this wasn't right. We remember them not as heroes, but as victims. Not of the enemy, but of their own side's ambition. Not of chaos, but of command. And maybe that's the most sacred form of memory there is. The kind that doesn't try to make you feel good. The kind that makes you remember clearly. Because they deserve that. The man who bled out in a field that would be abandoned hours later deserves that. The runner who fell holding a ceasefire notice that arrived too late deserves that. Henry Gunther, who was told he wasn't patriotic, who charged to prove he was still worth something, who died alone in the final 60 seconds, deserves that. And so on this November 11th, and every one that follows, don't just pause at 11 o'clock. Pause at 10:59. Pause at 10:45. Pause at the moment when someone somewhere could have said, stop, but said nothing. Remember that war doesn't end in fanfare. It ends in silence that arrives too late. It ends with the last man who thought the order was right and found out, too late, that it wasn't. And if you truly want to honor the dead, if you want to mean the words, never again, then you must start with the ones who died in peace, not war, in agreement, not combat, in the final hour, not the fight, because they didn't die for victory. They died for a delay, and there is no honor in that, only memory and responsibility.